Ever see that Garfield meme floating around online that says, "You are not immune to propaganda"? It's funny and a little silly, but the message behind it is more poignant than you think. We can be educated on the effects of advertising, propaganda, and persuasive techniques, but that doesn't make our brains completely immune to their effects. Don't believe me? Let's dive a little deeper. Welcome back. Or, if you're new here, welcome to the Media Literacy Guidebook. In today's video, we're going to explore the basics of propaganda and persuasion. This is meant to be a general overview, as you could spend months, if not years, diving into the nuances of these topics, but it should give you a good starting point. Buckle in, because this is going to be a long one. To begin, we have to understand the difference between education, persuasion, and propaganda. Education is, in one sense, what I've been trying to do with these videos. The goals of education include, but are not limited to, teaching an individual or group of people factual information, how to seek that information, based reasoned conclusions on that information, and incorporate it into their life schema and general knowledge. Education is more than just transferring knowledge from educator to student. It also relies on the educator understanding how to make information relevant to the learner in ways that are engaging, or at least interesting. On the learner's end, they need to put in the effort to practice, fail, experiment, and try again to incorporate knowledge into their long-term memory. Ideally, the information being taught is factual, logical, and includes some kind of relevancy to the learner's life. You might ask why I'm including education in this video, and it's a fair question. Education can be seen as a form of propaganda or persuasion depending on your values, beliefs, and culture. In a sense, I'm making these videos as a way of trying to convince you that these topics are important to learn and care about. As of the writing of the script, the United States is going through a vast anti-intellectual phase, questioning facts and currently held theories on everything from proven science to sociology. You can provide a person with all the facts and logically correct information you have, but for many, their ingrained beliefs, values, or culture can convince them otherwise. Consider, briefly, the misunderstood belief that many have about vaccines. Despite numerous scientific studies and critical journalism proving otherwise, many still believe that vaccines can cause autism based on the marketing of one former doctor. And we're seeing the ramifications of this today, such as babies and children getting and dying from what would have been easily preventable diseases due to a misinformed belief. Persuasion is a form of communication that attempts to satisfy the needs of both persuader and persuadee. In this case, the persuader uses factual information with emotional appeals to change a person's mind and promote some sort of desired behavior. Aristotle defined persuasion as communication designed to influence listeners' choices. You could still be factual and informative with persuasion, but ultimately the goal is to convince the listener or persuadee to do something or to change their beliefs. Remember that Aristotle defined three rhetorical appeals as they relate to persuasion: ethos, which is the speaker's credibility; pathos, the emotional appeals; and logos, or logical arguments, which we've discussed before. If a speaker is believable or imbued with authority, uses factual arguments in a reasoned presentation, and gains an audience's attention through emotional means, persuasion is possible. Persuasion tends to be a socially acceptable way of attempting to change people's attitudes or actions. So, for example, you wouldn't force your friend to help you pack and move your stuff, but you might be able to persuade them with, say, concert tickets and a nice dinner. In most democratic societies, government attempts to persuade using the press and public relations to sell its ideas to Congress and the general public. They use print, broadcast, and digital media to present their ideas. Unfortunately, these ideas aren't always accurate or true, as we've all experienced to some degree. Remember that all human communication, advertising, lectures, closing arguments, campaign speeches, influencers, etc., use persuasion, and to some extent propaganda, in an attempt to mold or change a listener's or viewer's attitude. With that being said, let's start by talking about what propaganda is. Okay, before we can define propaganda, we have to briefly discuss Edward Bernays and his influence. Despite being commonly known as the father of public relations, in truth he was a propagandist and contributed a tremendous amount of harm to the larger culture that we all share. Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, employed much of Freud's psychological ideas in his advertising, and one infamous example is his Torches of Freedom campaign. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women who smoked cigarettes were seen as dirty and lowbrow, often equated them with being sex workers or lower class. It was unfeminine to smoke, even in the privacy of one's own home. But women were also an untapped market, and Bernays recognized that. Tying the concept of women's suffrage to smoking, Bernays believed that he could encourage women to smoke and change the general public's perception of women smoking by tying the action to concepts like freedom, independence, and liberation. Working with cigarette brand Lucky Strikes, Bernays staged a Torches of Freedom march down Fifth Avenue in New York City during the 1929 Easter Parade. On the surface, it was taken as commentary for women's rights and for gender equality. In reality, Bernays planted 30 debutantes to participate in the march while smoking, with hopes that figures from the women's rights movement would join in solidarity. This received massive coverage at the time, with other marches taking place across the country. This helped shape the public's opinion of women smoking, but even better for Bernays and the American Tobacco Company, sold more cigarettes than they would have otherwise. In Bernays' own words,
I found that ideas were weapons and were even more effective than bullets.
Little chunk of history. In the 17th century, the Vatican established the Sacra Congregatio di Propaganda Fide, or the Sacred Congregation for Propagating the Faith of the Roman Catholic Church, with apologies to Italians for poor pronunciation. The intent behind the Propaganda Fide was to spread faith to the New World and oppose the Protestants while they were at it. Bernays argued that the term propaganda lost its once neutral meaning, to sow or disseminate information. Its subsequent use after the Propaganda Fide made the word a pejorative. Of course, to the people to whom the message was being spread to via Catholic missionaries, it wasn't exactly altruistic or peaceful. There is so much more to be said about Bernays, but if you take away nothing else, consider this brief passage from his book, aptly called Propaganda.
It has been found possible so to mold the mind of the masses that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction. In the present structure of society, this practice is inevitable. Whatever of social importance is done today, whether in politics, finance, manufacture, agriculture, charity, education, or other fields, must be done with the help of propaganda. Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Universal literacy was supposed to educate the common man to control his environment. Once he could read and write, he would have a mind fit to rule. So ran the democratic doctrine. But instead of a mind, universal literacy has given him rubber stamps. Rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with trivialities of the tabloids and the platitudes of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamps are the duplicates of millions of others, so that when those millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. It may seem an exaggeration to say that the American public gets most of its ideas in this wholesale fashion. The mechanism by which ideas are disseminated on a large scale is propaganda, in the broad sense of an organized effort to spread a particular belief or doctrine.
So, propaganda employs persuasive techniques, but it differs in persuasion in purpose. If persuasion is the art of convincing someone your position or beliefs are correct using factual information, propaganda is lying to someone through misleading or false information. For our purposes, we'll be using communication scholars Jowett and O'Donnell's definition of propaganda. Propaganda is the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Let's break these words down just a little for more understanding. Shaping perceptions. So, propaganda attempts to change or control your perceptions through language and through images. Think slogans, posters, symbols, even architecture to a degree. Each person has their own perceptual field unique to them. Think your cognition plus your five senses. That's formed by influences of values, roles, group norms, and self-image. Some examples of shaping perceptions through language could include government reports on hunger in America that say food insecurity instead of hunger. Descriptions of suicide by war captives are labeled as self-injurious behavior. Interrogations could be described as debriefing, and so on. How about shaping perceptions through symbols? Well, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, symbolic yellow ribbons were put on trees, fences, buildings, cars, and jewelry to indicate support of the US military. The ritual of tying yellow ribbons can be traced back to the American Civil War, when women wore yellow ribbons for their loved ones who were away at war. Remember that as perceptions are shaped, cognition can be manipulated. Once a belief or attitude is formed, a person's perceptions are influenced by it. None of this happens in a vacuum. The formation of cognition and attitude is a complex process related to cultural and personal values and emotions. Propagandists understand that our constructed meanings, such as race and gender, are related to both our past understanding of language and images and the culture and context in which they appear. Perception is dependent on our attitudes towards issues and our feelings about them. What happens then when your perceptions are formed by propaganda? Here's an example. The Voice of America during World War II had a stated directive to manipulate the cognitions of both the enemy and America's allies. It was to, quote, spread the contagion of fear among our enemies, but to also spread the contagion of hope, confidence, and determination among our friends. Direction of a specific behavior is another intent of propaganda. In the 1991 Gulf War, the U.S. Fort Psychological Operations Group dropped 29 million leaflets on Iraqi forces to attract defectors. A U.S. radio program, Voice of the Gulf, featured testimonials from happy Iraqi prisoners of war, along with prayers from the Quran and the location of the bomb targets for the next day. 75% of Iraqi defectors said that they were influenced by the leaflets and the radio broadcast. Finally, in our definition, we have achieving a response, and these last words are the key to the definition of propaganda. The only person who benefits from the audience's response, if the response is the desired one, is the propagandist. People in the audience may think the propagandist has their interest at heart, but in fact the propagandist's motives are self-serving. Selfish motives are not necessarily negative, however. Your judgment is going to depend on what ideology you support. So, returning to the Voice of America broadcast, people who listened to these broadcasts from behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War found a certain level of satisfaction for their hunger for information, and it appeared that the Voice of America had altruistic motives. The information that these people received from Voice of America, however, was ideologically injected to shape positive perceptions about the United States and its allies, and to manipulate attitude towards democracy, capitalism, and freedom. On the surface, this seems altruistic, but it's deliberately designed to facilitate acceptance of an ideology. All of this to say is that the study of contemporary propaganda in both oppressed and free societies is a very complex endeavor. You must understand that one's perception of a form of communication determines what is self-evident and what is controversial. In other words, one person's propaganda may be another person's education. In the definition we use, the elements of deliberate intent and manipulation, along with a systemic plan to achieve a purpose that is advantageous to the propagandist, however, distinguish propaganda from a free and open exchange of ideas. Now that we have a working definition of propaganda, we can begin to examine how propaganda works. Let's begin by taking a look at different types of propaganda. Agitative propaganda attempts to rouse an audience to certain ends, usually resulting in significant change. It wants to arouse people from apathy by giving them some kind of feasible action to carry out to support some cause or belief. Integrative propaganda, on the other hand, attempts to render an audience passive, accepting, and non-challenging. This type wants to maintain positions and interests of people in power who will then sponsor and sanction the propaganda message. Propaganda can also be described as white, gray, or black in relationship to its source and its accuracy of information. White propaganda comes from a source that is identified correctly, and the information in the message tends to be accurate. This attempts to build credibility with the audience and can be useful for the propagandist at some point in the future. An example of this could be national celebrations with very overt patriotism and regional chauvinism. While the information here might be considered true, it's still propaganda. The audience gets little, if anything, out of it, while the power goes to the propagandist. With black propaganda, the source is concealed or credited to a false authority and tends to spread lies, fabrications, and deceptions. This includes all types of creative deceit. For a really infamous example of black propaganda, in 1903, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written by Tsar Nicholas II's secret police. These portrayed Jewish people as demonic schemers. The chapters claimed to be the quote-unquote real minutes of a secret council of Jews discussing their plot for world domination. They were serialized and released in 1905 as part of a propaganda campaign by Russia to incite anti-Semitism, and also used during the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to encourage widespread slaughter of Jews. Despite this being exposed in 1921 as false, the text continued to spread thanks to conspiracy theorists. Eventually, this led to Hitler citing the protocols in Mein Kampf, and it was spread throughout Nazi propaganda as alleged proof of the alleged evil of the Jewish people. Also consider disinformation, which is false, incomplete, or misleading information that is passed or confirmed to a targeted individual, group, or country. This is also a form of black propaganda. This would be in comparison to misinformation, which is misguided or erroneous info. The success or failure of black propaganda depends on the receiver's willingness to accept the credibility of the source and the content of the message. Deliberate care has to be taken to place the sources and messages within the social, cultural, and political framework of the target audience. If the sender misunderstands the message and designs a message that doesn't fit, black propaganda may appear suspicious and tends to fail. Gray propaganda is odd and falls somewhere in the middle. The source may or may not be correctly identified, and the accuracy of the information is uncertain. For example, from 1966 to 1967, Radio Free Europe was organized, financed, and controlled by the CIA, which publicly denied any connection. A fund appeal on American television, radio, and mail indicated that Radio Free Europe was dependent on voluntary contributions known as truth dollars. The actual purpose of the appeal was to fortify the deception and dispel rumors about a CIA relationship. Gray propaganda is more widespread than you'd think. Consider companies that distort statistics on annual reports, advertising that suggests a product will achieve results that it can't, films that are made solely for product placement, or television evangelicists who will personally keep the money they solicit for religious causes. These all tend to fall within gray propaganda. So now that we know what the difference is between education, persuasion, and propaganda, and we have a working theory on what propaganda is, how can we better recognize when we're faced with it? Let's look at some persuasive and propaganda techniques. With these examples, I'll also provide clarifying questions to help you think through what you're experiencing. Testimonials. Testimonials involve respected people endorsing a product or idea. This can be politicians, sports figures, actors, authors, famous doctors, etc. If it's coming from a celebrity, the hope is that you'll use the product or support the idea because they do. Ask yourself, who is quoted in the testimonial? Is this person really an expert about it? Does the product or an idea have value with or without this endorsement? Bandwagoning. This creates the impression that there is widespread support for a thing or idea. People are going along with the rest of the crowd. Think of the phrase, jumping on the bandwagon. Generally speaking, people want to be part of a group, especially one that's winning. And most of us don't want to be the odd one out. We want to fit in. There's peer pressure happening here. So ask yourself, does the message provide reasons for joining the group? Is there any evidence for or against joining in? Why do I need to join this group so badly, and to what end? Name calling. This uses negative words or ad hominem attacks to create fear and dislike for people, ideas, and institutions. It can be verbal or visual. If it's the latter, it'll show a person or thing in an unflattering way. We often see this in political cartoons, news talk shows, and political attack ads. So ask, who is being called what? Is there a real connection between the names and the person or idea being attacked? And if this person or idea was so threatening, why resort to the lowest common denominator rather than address the facts or issues? Glittering generalities. Glittering generalities shows the subject of the message in a positive light, but provides little or no information. It uses simple, clever, easy to remember, but hard to verify slogans to appeal to people's emotions. Ask, what do these slogans or catchphrases really mean? What information am I missing to really understand or learn more? Card stacking. Card stacking uses facts or figures to show one side as positive and the other as negative. The message shows only positive info about the person or product or idea, and only negative or damaging information about the competition or opposition. But this is a cognitive trick. It's meant to make you think that you're hearing both sides, but you're actually only getting one perspective. So ask, are facts being changed or left out? What other pieces of information do you need to make an informed decision? Plain folks. This is a technique meant to send a message that a product or person is just like you. This could be an ordinary person vouching for how great a product is, or a politician having their picture taken in coffee shops or in factories, etc. The idea is to gain your trust by showing that people just like you use the product or support the person or idea. Ask, can I trust the person who is speaking or acting? What are the person's motive for visiting this place? Is this person really like me, and does or should that matter? Finally, transfer. Transfer uses your feelings about one thing to get you to feel the same way about something else. This can be positive, to persuade you to like or support something, or negative, to dislike something. Images can be symbolic, such as a flag standing for patriotism, repulsive, anti-smoking ads, hateful, comparing someone to Hitler, etc. All of this to say is they act as wordless messages that most people can recognize, if not identify with. Think back to our conversations about semiotics and semantics for more information. With transferring, you want to ask, what is this image trying to get me to feel? And is there an actual connection between the image and the person or product? So that's the basics of understanding propaganda and persuasion. These are extremely nuanced topics with so much more to discuss, but I hope it serves as a solid starting point. It's also important to remember that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, knowing how propaganda works doesn't mean you're immune to its effects. As Andrea Pizza says, we live in an increasingly propagandized society. Our culture is saturated with media and encourages heavy media consumption without critical thought, so it's impossible to completely isolate yourself from persuasive or propagandist rhetoric. But the first step in taking back some control of your time, cognition, and culture is to educate yourself. And with any luck, this video provided some of the first steps. Today's recommended media. Next comes what? Propaganda AI and the accompanying article, The Propaganda Loop, by Andrea Pizza. While Andrea's focus is on AI, both pieces are great case studies on how current conversations and thoughts around AI are influenced by propaganda. Links to both are in the description. If you have 4 hours to kill, you should watch the BBC documentary The Century of the Self, which goes into more details about Bernays, control of the public through advertising and public relations, and manipulation of cognition and perspective through the media. The link to the playlist is also in the description. As always, don't forget that if you have any questions for me or suggestions on what you'd like me to talk about next, comment down below or email me at professorgoggles@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and with any luck, I'll see you again soon. Take care.